April 16th, 1945. The sky over Berlin is filled with a grim foreboding as the first rays of dawn break through the clouds of smoke and ash that hang heavy in the air. The roar of artillery rings out from the east, a constant reminder of the approaching storm. Soviet forces, having encircled the city, prepare for the final assault, the ultimate battle to bring down the Third Reich. Their movements are deliberate, their strategy refined, honed over years of brutal conflict. The ground trembles beneath their feet as heavy tanks rumble across the war-torn terrain, inching closer to the heart of Berlin. These soldiers, drenched in the blood and sweat of an unforgiving campaign, know that they are standing at the edge of history. This is the moment that will decide the fate of Europe, the final act in the brutal drama that has defined the past 6 years. On the other side, the defenders of Berlin brace for impact. They are a shattered force, overwhelmed by the numbers and firepower of the Red Army. Yet they are not ready to surrender. Men who once wore the uniform of a proud military machine now fight with the desperate resolve of those facing certain defeat. Hitler's orders to defend the city to the last man echo in their ears, even as they know that no reinforcements are coming. The Nazi regime has crumbled, and with it, any hope for a victorious conclusion. But here, in the ruins of the capital, the final stand will unfold. The Soviet advance is relentless. Each step closer to Berlin brings them into the heart of a city brimming with history, culture, and the weight of Nazi ideology. The artillery fire grows louder, each blast rattling the buildings, shaking the very soul of the city. The men of the Wehrmacht, once invincible, now fight for survival, clutching their weapons as if they can stave off the inevitable. The sound of their guns is drowned out by the thundering Russian barrage, their cries for help lost in the chaos of the advancing Soviet horde. The air is thick with tension, and the smell of gunpowder hangs heavy. In the streets, where the blood of the fallen has already begun to stain the cobblestones, the Soviet forces make their way forward, inching ever closer to the heart of the Reich. The battle is no longer about tactics or strategy. It is about survival. It is about honor. It is about the last vestiges of a broken empire refusing to go quietly into the night. This is the Battle of Berlin, the final act in a war that has cost millions of lives, shattered nations, and turned Europe into a desolate wasteland. But as the Soviets close in, the world watches in suspense, knowing that this will be the end of an era. The last stand of the Reich is about to unfold, and it will determine the future of a continent and the world. The end of Nazi Germany is near, but first, there will be one last fight. Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, had become a symbol of the Reich's ambition, its culture, and its tyranny. But by April 1945, it was nothing more than a fortress under siege, an empire clinging to its last breath. The origins of the Battle of Berlin lay in the long and bloody path that had led the Red Army to the city's doorstep. The Allied advance from the west had all but sealed Germany's fate, but it was the Soviet forces to the east, under the indomitable Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who would have the final say. As the winter months gave way to spring, Soviet forces had driven through Poland and into eastern Germany. The Red Army had swept across the Eastern Front with a brutal efficiency, their soldiers hardened by years of combat. By mid-April, the Soviet steamroller had reached the Oder River, a mere 60 kilometers from Berlin. For Adolf Hitler, this was the beginning of the end. Berlin was to be defended at all costs, and with the city's defenses already crumbling, the Wehrmacht's last-ditch effort was to rely on untrained civilians, Hitler Youth, and a handful of veteran soldiers to stave off the inevitable. The Soviet approach to Berlin was methodical. The Red Army was massive, with over 2 million soldiers, 7,500 tanks, and 7,500 aircraft ready to bring the city to its knees. The men and women of the Red Army knew what awaited them, a bitter, bloody battle that would test their resolve, but they were fueled by a singular purpose: revenge. For every soldier who had fallen in the past 3 years of brutal fighting, for every civilian caught in the madness of Hitler's war, Berlin would be the final reckoning. Zhukov, known for his ruthless military tactics, had prepared for the assault meticulously. To encircle Berlin was the first step. To sever all escape routes for the German defenders was the key to breaking their resolve. His forces began their assault on April 16th, the first salvo of artillery sending shockwaves through the city, rattling the windows of Berlin's famed Reichstag. The sound of exploding shells was deafening, and the city began to shake as if it were coming apart at the seams. The defenders, a ragtag collection of weary Wehrmacht soldiers, the Volkssturm militia, and young boys pressed into service, fought back with whatever they had left. Their strategy, however, was clear. Hold the line and buy time. Time for what, though? Time for the inevitable. As the Soviet artillery pounded the outer defenses, a sense of dread pervaded Berlin. Hitler, holed up in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, refused to acknowledge the reality of the situation. He ordered the city to be defended at all costs, but his orders had little meaning now. The Wehrmacht had been worn thin, and the resources needed to fend off the Soviet assault were long gone. The German people, already living in a constant state of fear, were now caught between two horrors: the oncoming Soviet juggernaut and the madness of a Führer who would never accept defeat. The siege of Berlin had begun. The city's once proud streets were now the setting for a desperate final stand. Each day brought more artillery fire, more destruction, and more death. In the distance, the smoke from burning buildings hung thick in the air as Soviet forces encroached ever closer to the heart of the city. It was clear that the end was near. In the crumbling ruins of Berlin, the defenders knew that they were fighting not just for their lives, but for an ideology that had long since passed into the realm of myth. The Soviets, determined to avenge their fallen comrades and bring an end to the Nazi regime, moved forward relentlessly. The Reichstag, the symbol of Nazi power, loomed in the distance, the focal point of the coming battle. Soon, both sides would be locked in a final, brutal contest to control the last vestige of Nazi Germany. Berlin's fate, and with it, the fate of Europe, would be decided in this final confrontation. The city was under siege, and the question was no longer if Berlin would fall, but when. The Soviet advance toward Berlin was not just a triumph of strategy and sheer numbers. It was also the culmination of years of industrial might. Behind every tank that rumbled across the battlefield, every bomb that fell upon the enemy, and every soldier who marched in the vanguard of the Red Army, there was an industrial engine that powered this unstoppable force. The story of the Battle of Berlin is in many ways the story of Soviet production. The factories, the workers, and the weapons that made the Red Army the most formidable fighting force on the European continent. By the time the Soviets were closing in on Berlin, the Soviet Union had transformed itself into a vast war machine, producing weapons at an unparalleled scale. Under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet war economy was built on a foundation of sheer numbers and the relentless pursuit of military superiority. The factories that had once produced civilian goods were now churning out munitions, tanks, and aircraft around the clock. Entire cities were devoted to war production, with workers toiling in conditions that were often nothing short of brutal. One of the key figures behind this industrial revolution was Andrei Tupolev, a visionary engineer who helped develop the strategic bombers that would play a key role in the Soviet campaign. Alongside Tupolev's innovations in aviation, the Soviet Union also produced the iconic T-34 tank, arguably the most effective and widely produced tank of World War II. The T-34's powerful 76.2mm gun, sloped armor, and unmatched mobility made it the backbone of the Soviet armored forces. By the time the Battle of Berlin began, the Soviets had over 3,000 T-34s ready for the assault. In addition to the T-34, the Soviets also relied heavily on the Katyusha rocket launcher, nicknamed Stalin's organ, for the terrifying sound of its rockets as they streaked through the air. These multiple rocket launchers were able to deliver devastating barrages that tore apart German positions and sowed panic within their ranks. The sound of a Katyusha barrage was enough to send even the most battle-hardened German soldiers into a frenzy. The scale of Soviet industrial production was staggering. During the war, the Soviet Union produced more than 80,000 tanks, 100,000 aircraft, and over 1 million trucks. These numbers were unprecedented and far surpassed anything that Germany could hope to match. As the Red Army advanced on Berlin, the sheer weight of this industrial power began to make its presence felt. Soviet artillery pieces pounded German positions, while thousands of aircraft provided close air support, striking key military installations and cutting off any chance of escape for the German defenders. But the battle for Berlin was also a reminder of the sacrifices made on the home front. The Soviet workers who built these weapons were not just factory hands. They were the lifeblood of the Soviet war effort. Many of them worked in conditions that could only be described as grueling. In some factories, workers would sleep next to the machines, only to be woken up at the sound of an air raid siren. Others worked 16-hour shifts, often in overcrowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Yet despite the hardships, they produced an astonishing quantity of military hardware that gave the Red Army the firepower needed to break through the defenses of Berlin. In contrast, the German war economy had long been crippled by the weight of Allied bombing raids and the severe shortages of raw materials. While the Nazis were able to produce some remarkable weapons, such as the jet-powered Me-262 fighter and the V-2 rocket, their industrial capabilities were no match for the vast Soviet production lines. Hitler's insistence on fighting to the last man meant that Germany could not field the numbers necessary to hold off the Soviet advance. As the Soviets closed in on Berlin, the industrial war machine that had fueled their rise to power was now in full motion. The relentless production of weapons, the tireless work of Soviet factories, and the staggering numbers of tanks and artillery that marched toward Berlin would determine the outcome of the battle. The Germans, with their morale shattered and their production lines decimated, had no choice but to fight on, even as the overwhelming force of Soviet industry bore down on them. The Soviets, with their unmatched industrial might, had arrived at the gates of Berlin. The battle for the city would soon turn into a contest not only of weapons and tactics, but of raw industrial power, with the Red Army's relentless production lines proving to be the decisive factor in the ultimate defeat of the Nazi regime. Berlin, once the capital of the most fearsome empire in Europe, would now face the crushing weight of Soviet industry and the end of the Third Reich. On April 16, 1945, the first salvo of Soviet artillery shattered the silence of Berlin's outer defenses, signaling the beginning of the end for the German capital. The first wave of Soviet soldiers advanced, their faces grim with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The Red Army had spent years preparing for this moment, and now the Soviet forces, under the command of Marshal Zhukov, were ready to breach the city's formidable defenses. The Battle of Berlin had begun. The German defenses were formidable, but not nearly as strong as they had once been. The Wehrmacht, battered by years of retreat, was now largely composed of young boys from the Hitler Youth, older men from the Volkssturm militia, and remnants of the regular army. They had been thrown together to form a defense force that was as much a desperate symbol of Nazi ideology as it was a viable fighting force. Despite this, they fought fiercely, knowing that their survival depended on holding back the Soviets for as long as possible. The streets of Berlin were filled with the sounds of gunfire, the roar of Soviet tanks, and the cries of men and women caught in the chaos of battle. The first assault was brutal. Soviet artillery fired relentlessly at the outer defensive positions, raining shells down on German positions. The defenders, entrenched in buildings and bunkers, tried to hold their ground, but the sheer weight of Soviet firepower made it clear that the battle was only going to intensify. The city was already burning, with explosions shaking the buildings as Soviet tanks moved forward, crushing everything in their path. The Germans had planned their defense around the idea of slowing the Soviet advance long enough to force a stalemate, but they quickly realized that this would not be possible. The Soviet forces had the firepower, the manpower, and the momentum to break through any obstacle. The Soviet tanks, led by the T-34s, stormed through the streets, while infantry followed behind, clearing the way. The streets, once a bustling center of civilization, were now war zones, with buildings reduced to rubble and the dead and wounded strewn across the ground. Despite the overwhelming Soviet advance, the German defenders did not give up easily. They fought fiercely, engaging the Soviets in bitter close-quarters combat. Every building, every street corner, became a battleground. The Germans fought from window to window, floor to floor, using the city's terrain to their advantage. But the Soviets, relentless in their drive toward the heart of the city, pushed forward, step by step, each block won at a heavy cost. The battle for Berlin was unlike any other. The city's defenses, though weakening, were still formidable. The Germans, driven by the desperate need to hold on to their crumbling capital, fought with a fanatical resolve that defied logic. But the Soviets, unrelenting and tireless, pushed forward, knowing that the fall of Berlin was the key to ending the war in Europe. With every inch gained, they moved closer to their goal, the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of the Nazi regime. As the first day of the battle drew to a close, the Germans had been pushed back, but they had not yet surrendered. The fight was only just beginning. The Soviet forces, having secured the outer perimeter of the city, now set their sights on the heart of Berlin itself. The Germans, with their backs to the wall, would fight to the bitter end. But it was clear that the Red Army's advance could not be stopped. The siege had begun in earnest, and the outcome was all but decided. Berlin was under attack, and there was no turning back. The city would either fall to the Soviets or be completely destroyed in the process. The battle was now a matter of survival for both sides, and the horrors of war would play out in the streets of Berlin for weeks to come. As Soviet forces pushed deeper into Berlin, the fighting shifted from the outer defenses to the very heart of the city itself. No longer just a battle of artillery and tanks, the conflict now became an urban nightmare, a desperate, bloody struggle fought in the maze of streets, alleys, and ruined buildings that had once symbolized the power and grandeur of Nazi Germany. The city of Berlin, once the jewel of the Third Reich, was now a crumbling fortress, its streets filled with the stench of death, smoke, and the roar of combat. The Soviets, led by Marshal Zhukov, had long anticipated the challenges of urban warfare. Berlin's vast network of streets, its dense concentration of buildings, and its well-fortified positions made it a nightmare for any army attempting to storm its defenses. But the Red Army was a well-oiled machine, and their soldiers, hardened by years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, were accustomed to the close-quarters combat that the city demanded. Every building had to be cleared, room by room, floor by floor. Each corner concealed enemy soldiers, snipers, and booby traps, making each advance a deadly gamble. For the German defenders, this was a fight to the death. The Wehrmacht's soldiers, once a proud and formidable fighting force, were now reduced to a desperate, makeshift army. The average age of the soldiers defending Berlin was shockingly young. Many were barely out of their teens, drawn from the Hitler Youth or the Volkssturm militia. Older men, once veterans of the early victories of the German army, had been pressed into service alongside these boys. Their numbers, once formidable, had dwindled to just a fraction of their former strength. They had been told to hold Berlin at all costs, and the only thing left was their unyielding resolve. The first wave of Soviet forces encountered stiff resistance as they advanced through the city's outer neighborhoods. The German defenders, despite being outgunned and outmanned, fought fiercely. The narrow streets of Berlin provided the perfect cover for sniper fire, and the buildings, shattered by artillery, offered positions from which the Germans could stage their last stand. As Soviet tanks advanced, German soldiers, armed with anti-tank weapons and improvised explosives, ambushed the armored columns, hoping to slow them down. But the Soviets were relentless. With each step forward, their soldiers moved as if they had already accepted the inevitability of death. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, punctuated by the thunderous explosion of grenades and the roar of tanks firing at fortified positions. Soviet infantry, supported by the heavy weight of artillery, pressed forward, clearing one building after another. Each block taken from the Germans brought them closer to the Reichstag, the symbolic center of Nazi power. The battle for the Reichstag, which would become the focal point of the Soviet assault, was a brutal and unrelenting contest. The Germans had transformed the building into a fortress, fortifying it with machine guns, snipers, and an array of defensive positions. The Soviet soldiers knew that taking the Reichstag was not just a military objective. It was a symbolic gesture that would mark the end of the Nazi regime. To capture the building was to capture the heart of Nazi ideology itself. The Soviets, however, faced a deadly challenge. The Germans had entrenched themselves deep within the structure, determined to hold out as long as possible. Soviet soldiers, driven by both the need for revenge and the weight of history, stormed the building, using every available weapon at their disposal. The battle inside the Reichstag was a nightmarish scene of close combat, explosions rattling the walls, soldiers fighting hand-to-hand in the dimly lit hallways, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. As the Soviets closed in on the building's main chamber, the Germans made their last stand. They fought with desperation, but it was clear that they were fighting a losing battle. Soviet tanks and artillery continued their relentless bombardment, flattening buildings and leaving craters in the streets. The sounds of battle were deafening, but they were only a backdrop to the brutal hand-to-hand combat that raged within the ruins of the Reichstag. The first Soviet soldiers to reach the Reichstag's entrance encountered stiff resistance. The Germans, entrenched in their last stronghold, used every advantage of the building's structure to their benefit. Machine guns blazed, and sniper fire rang out, but the Soviets were determined. With the Reichstag in their sights, they pushed forward inch by inch until, at last, the Soviet flag was raised above the building. This was the moment that marked the symbolic end of Nazi Germany, the victory of the Soviet forces, but also the victory of the world's resistance to fascism. But even as the Reichstag fell, the battle was far from over. The Germans, though on the brink of defeat, were not yet willing to surrender. The fighting continued, street by street, as Soviet forces advanced deeper into the heart of Berlin. Every inch of ground gained came at a tremendous cost, but the Red Army was undeterred. They had fought through hell to reach this point, and they would not stop until Berlin was theirs. Inside the city, the civilians, caught between the two armies, were forced to endure the horrors of war. Thousands were killed in the crossfire, and many others were forced to flee as their homes were reduced to rubble. The streets, amidst the rubble and smoke, the Battle of Berlin was not just a clash of armies. It was a brutal human tragedy, where personal stories of courage, sacrifice, and desperation unfolded on every street corner. For the soldiers of the Red Army, the battle was not just a mission of military strategy, but one of revenge. The scars of the Eastern Front, where millions of Soviet soldiers had fallen at the hands of the Nazis, were still fresh. Every Soviet soldier marching toward Berlin carried the weight of these losses. Many had family members who had perished in the Nazi death camps. Others had witnessed the destruction of their cities and villages. The drive to take Berlin was, for many, not just a military objective, but a personal vendetta. In the heart of the battle, the human cost of war was laid bare. Among the German defenders were young boys, Hitler Youth, forced into the conflict before they had even tasted adulthood. For them, the battle for Berlin was a final, tragic stand for a lost cause. As the Soviet forces closed in, these boys fought with a mixture of fear, defiance, and desperation, often armed with little more than rifles and a belief in the Nazi ideals they had been raised to worship. One such boy, barely 16, was found clutching a rifle in the ruins of the Reichstag, his face a mask of terror. His comrades had all fallen, and the last hope of victory was a distant dream. In his eyes, there was no glory, only a hopeless duty to the end. For the civilians of Berlin, the battle was an overwhelming experience of fear and despair. Caught between two warring armies, they faced a horrific fate. Thousands of women, children, and elderly people were killed or wounded in the crossfire, while others were forced to flee their homes, seeking shelter in the underground bunkers that had been built to protect them from Allied bombing raids. The sound of artillery was relentless, and the streets were filled with the wounded, the dying, and the desperate. Yet, amidst the devastation, small acts of bravery emerged. Medics and volunteers, often without proper training, risked their lives to save others, while civilians helped to clear the rubble and rescue the trapped. The stories of the soldiers, both Soviet and German, along with those of the civilians caught in the carnage, reflected the immense human cost of war. The battle for Berlin, a city that had once been a symbol of power, had become a symbol of sacrifice, as both sides fought not just for territory, but for the legacy of a broken world. As the Soviet forces closed in on the heart of Berlin, the final days of the battle became a race against time. The city was now a vast, smoldering ruin, its buildings crumbling, its streets littered with debris, and its once proud monuments reduced to ashes. The relentless Soviet artillery and airstrikes had taken their toll, leaving the defenders in a state of exhaustion, barely holding on. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, the German forces, led by the few remaining officers and fanatical volunteers, continued to fight with a grim determination. But it was clear to all that victory was no longer an option. Berlin was falling. By April 30th, Soviet forces had reached the center of the city, and the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of the Nazi regime, was surrounded. The fall of Berlin was imminent. Yet, even as his empire crumbled, Adolf Hitler remained holed up in his underground Führer bunker, refusing to face reality. Surrounded by a dwindling number of loyal staff and soldiers, Hitler clung to the belief that a miracle could save Germany. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. Berlin was lost. In his final hours, Hitler's behavior became increasingly erratic. On the afternoon of April 30th, as Soviet soldiers advanced to within a few hundred meters of his bunker, Hitler chose to take his own life. The dictator's end was as tragic as it was symbolic, an ignoble conclusion to the grandiose ambitions that had once threatened to dominate Europe. His death marked the true end of the Nazi regime. Berlin's fate was sealed, and with it, the fate of Germany itself. In the streets above, Soviet soldiers fought with renewed vigor, knowing that the Reichstag was within their grasp. The last German defenders, mostly elderly men, women, and Hitler youth, fought to the bitter end, but they were no match for the superior Soviet forces. As Soviet tanks rolled into Berlin's center, and infantry pushed through the remaining German positions, the sense of inevitability was palpable. The Reichstag fell to Soviet control on May 2, 1945, with the raising of the red flag over the building, marking the final, resounding blow to the Nazi regime. The fall of Berlin was not just the physical defeat of the city, it was the collapse of Hitler's vision, a vision that had led millions to their deaths. The city that had once stood as the symbol of Nazi power was now in ruins, its conquest marking the end of an era. The war in Europe was over, but the scars left by the battle for Berlin would endure for generations. The fall of Berlin was a turning point, not only in the war but in the history of Europe. As Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag on May 2, 1945, it was a symbol of both victory and devastation. The battle had claimed the lives of an estimated 80,000 Soviet soldiers and tens of thousands of German civilians, while the city itself lay in ruins. The immediate aftermath of the battle left Germany in shambles, its once proud capital now a ghost town. Berlin, the heart of the Nazi Empire, had been utterly destroyed in the final days of the conflict, and the physical and psychological toll on the nation was immense. The destruction of Berlin was a reflection of Germany's total defeat. The once thriving metropolis was now a war-torn wasteland, its streets pockmarked with craters, its buildings reduced to rubble. The iconic landmarks, the Brandenburg Gate, the Reichstag, the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, were all scarred by the relentless Soviet bombardment. For the civilians who had survived the battle, the war's end was no cause for celebration. Many were left to sift through the ashes of their homes, their families, and their livelihoods. The survivors faced a grim reality, a broken country, a shattered economy, and the loss of their place in the world. The battle for Berlin marked the effective end of Nazi Germany. On May 8, 1945, just days after the city fell, Germany officially surrendered, bringing an end to the war in Europe. However, the consequences of the battle extended far beyond the fall of Berlin. The city, once a beacon of Nazi ideology, was now the site of occupation and division. In the years that followed, Berlin would be split into East and West, with the Soviets taking control of the eastern sector and the Allies overseeing the western part. This division would become a focal point of the Cold War, with Berlin symbolizing the ideological struggle between communism and democracy. Berlin's legacy as the site of the final battle of World War II served as both a warning and a reminder of the consequences of unchecked power and aggression. The brutality of the battle underscored the devastating cost of war, and the scars left on the city and on the collective memory of Germany would take decades to heal. Yet, amidst the rubble, a new Germany would begin to rise, one built not on the ashes of the past, but on the hope for a future free from the tyranny that had once consumed it. The fall of Berlin had shattered a nation, but it also marked the beginning of the healing process for a world forever changed by war. The Battle of Berlin, in its overwhelming destruction and human cost, served as the final chapter in the downfall of Nazi Germany. Berlin's fall was not merely a military victory. It was the closing act in a long and brutal war that had reshaped Europe and the world. The battle brought an end to Adolf Hitler's vision of an empire built on violence and oppression, but it left behind a fractured and devastated Germany, its capital in ruins and its people deeply scarred. The destruction of Berlin marked the tragic end of one of history's most destructive ideologies. It was a reminder of the horrors that can unfold when power, unchecked by morality, consumes an entire nation. Yet, in the aftermath of the battle, the world saw the beginning of a new era. Berlin, divided by the victors, became the focal point of the Cold War, symbolizing the stark ideological divide between the Soviet East and the capitalist West. As Europe began the difficult task of rebuilding, the legacy of Berlin's fall remained clear. The costs of war are immeasurable, and the path to peace requires the healing of deep wounds. The scars left by the Battle of Berlin would endure for generations, but so too would the resolve to never repeat such devastation.